The sun had barely begun to creep over the horizon when Morgan Steele took her first sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle her nerves. The truck stop was quiet, the usual early morning crowd of long-haul drivers filling up on burnt coffee and cheap eggs. It was a familiar routine, one that Morgan had grown to appreciate after too many years of living on the road, moving from one haul to the next. She had stopped at Ironwood Ridge's only truck stop the night before, looking for a place to rest before taking on her next job. The town itself was small, one of those dusty places that most people only ever pass through. It had a diner, a mechanic's shop, a grocery store, and not much else. But Morgan didn't mind. She preferred places where no one asked too many questions. That peace was shattered by the sound of approaching engines. At first, she barely registered it, assuming it was just another biker crew passing through. But then the rumble grew, louder, heavier. Conversation inside the truck stop faded as every head turned toward the large windows overlooking the parking lot. 15 motorcycles roared into the lot, moving with an unnatural precision, their headlights cutting through the dim morning light. Their riders wore matching leather vests, emblazoned with the insignia of a vulture clutching a skull in its talons. Morgan knew that symbol well. The Black Vultures, a gang with a reputation for leaving ruin in its wake. Smuggling, extortion, intimidation, wherever they went, trouble followed. And judging by the way they fanned out in the parking lot, they weren't just here for gas. Behind the counter, Ethan Parker let out a shaky breath. The young cashier looked between Morgan and Charlie Reynolds, the truck stop's owner. Charlie's expression turned grim, but he held his ground, wiping his hands on a dish towel before stepping toward the door. Morgan stayed put, her body tensing as she sized up the bikers. Something about the way they moved told her this wasn't just a casual visit. They were operating with intent. The engines cut off one by one, leaving behind an eerie silence. The leader stepped forward, a tall, wiry man with sharp features and a presence that oozed menace. Dante Reaper Vasquez, a name whispered in fear across the Southwest. He pulled off his gloves slowly, surveying the truck stop like it already belonged to him. Morgan felt the air shift. She had seen men like him before. They weren't interested in negotiations. Reaper's voice was smooth, casual even, but it carried an undeniable edge. This truck stop belongs to us now. Anyone coming through here pays a fee if they want to keep driving in one piece. Otherwise, accidents can happen. Charlie didn't flinch. I don't deal with scum like you. The response was immediate. Reaper flicked his fingers, and one of his men, a hulking brute with a shaved head, stepped forward, hefting a tire iron. Without hesitation, he hurled it through the window of a nearby parked truck. The glass shattered, sending a sharp crack through the still morning air. A few of the diners gasped. Ethan looked like he was about to pass out. Morgan remained seated, her mind already calculating angles, movements, and weaknesses. Reaper smirked. Consider that your first warning. We don't like to repeat ourselves. Morgan's pulse remained steady. She wasn't afraid of men like this. She had dealt with worse. The problem was, this wasn't just her fight. It was the town's. And Ironwood Ridge had just been marked as the Black Vulture's newest hunting ground. The tension in the truck stop thickened like an oncoming storm. Morgan took another slow sip of her coffee, her mind already dissecting the situation. The Black Vultures weren't bluffing. Men like Dante Reaper Vasquez didn't make idle threats. They came in, took control, and made sure no one dared challenge them. She set her cup down and stood, stretching casually, as if she weren't facing down a gang of enforcers. Her movement caught Reaper's eye, and for the first time since entering the truck stop, he looked directly at her. "And who might you be?" he asked, cocking his head slightly. "Just passing through," Morgan said. "Like everyone else." Reaper studied her for a beat, then smirked. "Smart. That means you can keep moving along before things get messy." Charlie Reynolds stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Ain't gonna happen. This is my place. You don't own it, and you sure as hell don't own this town." Reaper exhaled, shaking his head. "Old man, you must not know how this works." He motioned lazily to one of his men, who strode forward and shoved Charlie hard enough to send him stumbling back into the counter. Morgan moved without thinking. Her fist caught the enforcer across the jaw before he had time to react. The crack of bone was loud in the stunned silence. He reeled back, cursing, as he clutched his face. For a split second, no one moved. Then the entire truck stop exploded into chaos. Reaper's men lunged forward, but Morgan was faster. She sidestepped the first attacker and sent a sharp elbow into his ribs, driving the air from his lungs. Another swung a wild punch, but she ducked, grabbed his wrist, and twisted, forcing him to the ground with a pained grunt. Charlie grabbed a metal pipe from behind the counter and swung at the man who had shoved him, catching him in the shoulder. The other patrons scrambled, knocking over chairs as they tried to get away from the brewing fight. Reaper stayed back, watching with interest as Morgan systematically dismantled two of his men. When she finally straightened, breathing steady, she met his gaze again. His smirk widened. "Well now, looks like we got ourselves a wild one." Morgan wiped a trickle of blood from her knuckle. "Looks like." Reaper nodded to his men. "Enough." The remaining bikers hesitated before stepping back. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken threats. "All right, lady," Reaper said. "You want to play hero? Fine. But you just made things a lot harder for this town. You're lucky I'm in a generous mood today." He turned to Charlie. "We'll be back. And next time, there won't be any warnings." With that, he flicked his hand, and the black vultures began filing out. The roar of their engines filled the air again as they mounted their bikes. But before they left, Reaper pointed a finger at Morgan. "You should have just kept driving." Morgan didn't respond. She simply watched as they disappeared down the highway, leaving the truck stop in tense silence. Charlie let out a slow breath. Damn fools think they can just roll in and take over. Morgan turned to him. "They're not thinking. They know they can. And they will, unless someone stops them." Charlie studied her for a moment. "And you? You planning on sticking around for that?" Morgan exhaled. "Looks like I don't have much of a choice now." She glanced toward the highway, where the black vultures had vanished into the desert haze. This was just the beginning, and she knew Reaper wasn't done. The truck stop felt eerily quiet in the aftermath. Charlie Reynolds wiped the blood from his lip as he surveyed the damage. Overturned chairs, shattered glass, and the nervous faces of customers who had just seen how quickly peace could be shattered. Morgan stood by the window, watching the trail of dust left behind by the black vultures as they rode off into the distance. She had no doubt they'd be back. The question wasn't if, but when. Charlie exhaled heavily. "You really know how to make an impression, Steele." Morgan turned to face him. "They weren't going to stop, Charlie. You know that." He nodded grimly. "Yeah, I know. But now they're going to come at us twice as hard." Reaper's the kind of man that doesn't let a challenge slide. Morgan already knew that. She had seen his type before. Men who thrived on fear, who built their empires by making sure no one dared to stand against them. "Then we need to be ready," she said. "Because next time, they won't just be throwing threats." Charlie rubbed his face and let out a dry chuckle. "Hell, I should have retired years ago." "You still can," Morgan offered. "Get out of town before this gets worse." Charlie's expression hardened. "Nah, this is my place. I'm not running." Morgan respected that. But she also knew that stubborn pride wouldn't be enough to keep the vultures from taking what they wanted. "Then we need a plan," she said. "And people willing to fight." Charlie gave her a long look, then nodded. "I might know some folks. But if you're serious about this, you're going to need more than a couple of locals with shotguns." Morgan glanced at the highway again, her mind already working through possibilities. "I know someone who might be able to help." Morgan had spent years on the road, and in that time, she had made a few friends and a few enemies. One of those friends owed her a favor. She pulled into a dusty lot just outside of town, where an old repair shop sat on the edge of the desert. The sign overhead read Grady's Auto Va Salvage, though most people in the region knew the man behind it as something else entirely. Grady Colt was an ex-military mechanic with a knack for fixing things that shouldn't be fixable. His shop was more than just a place for repairs. It was a hub for people who operated outside the usual laws. Fighters, mercenaries, and those who didn't fit neatly into society's rules. If Morgan needed help, this was the place to get it. Grady was under the hood of an old Chevy when she arrived. He looked up, wiping grease from his hands, and smirked. Well, if it isn't Morgan Steele. Didn't think I'd see you again." Morgan leaned against the truck. "Need a favor." Grady laughed. "A favor? Last time you needed a favor, it cost me 2 broken ribs and a trashed safe house. And I got you out of that mess, didn't I?" Grady shook his head but motioned for her to follow him inside. All right, let's hear it. Inside, the shop smelled of oil and metal, the walls lined with tools and half-finished projects. Morgan laid it out for him. The Black Vultures, Reaper, the threat against Ironwood Ridge. She didn't sugarcoat it. When she was done, Grady leaned back against his workbench, arms crossed. You're telling me you want to take on the Black Vultures? Not alone. But they need to be stopped. And I know you've got connections. Grady exhaled. Damn it, Steele. You always did have a thing for lost causes. Morgan smirked. You in or not? After a long pause, Grady grinned. All right. But you better have a plan, because this is going to get messy. Morgan nodded. Oh, I'm counting on it. Morgan didn't waste time. With Grady on board, she knew they had a chance, but they needed more hands, and fast. The Black Vultures weren't just a gang, they were an infestation. If they got a foothold in Ironwood Ridge, the town would never shake them loose. She and Grady spent the next 2 days reaching out to those who had the most to lose. Charlie introduced them to ranchers and shop owners, people who had called Ironwood Ridge home long before the Vultures came sniffing around. Some were reluctant, fearful of retaliation, but Morgan laid it out clearly. They either stood together or let the Vultures carve up their town piece by piece. One by one, people started to agree. Farmers who had lost cattle to rustlers, mechanics who had been shaken down for free labor, and even a few ex-military guys who had chosen a quiet life until now. They met in the back of Charlie's truck stop, maps spread across tables, weapons checked and counted. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Charlie surveyed the group, arms crossed. We've got bodies, but most of these folks haven't fought a war. How do you plan to train them up before Reaper comes back? Morgan tightened the strap on her tactical vest. We don't need an army, Charlie. We need strategy. Grady grinned. That's where I come in. Grady's military background made him the perfect strategist. While Morgan worked on getting people ready, Grady started turning the town into a battlefield. He and a few of the ranchers set up defensive positions at key choke points, the only 2 roads leading into town, the truck stop and the local scrapyard. They reinforced barricades, rigged tripwires, and created emergency exit points in case things went south. Morgan focused on drilling the fighters. She paired them up, teaching them how to cover each other and how to move in sync. Even those who had never fired a gun before got crash courses on how to hold their own if it came to that. She caught sight of Ethan Parker, the young truck stop cashier, struggling with a rifle. You don't have to do this, she told him. Ethan swallowed hard, gripping the weapon tighter. If I don't fight now, when will I? Morgan nodded, giving him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Then let's make sure you're ready. The night before the Vultures were expected to return, the town was silent. People huddled in their homes, waiting. The fighters stood ready, watching the horizon. Then, at dawn, the familiar roar of motorcycles filled the air. Reaper was coming. And this time, Ironwood Ridge was ready. The distant rumble of engines sent a chill through Ironwood Ridge. Morgan stood at the truck stop's entrance, her eyes locked on the horizon as dust plumes rose. Here they come, Grady muttered beside her, tightening his grip on his shotgun. The Black Vultures didn't arrive cautiously. They rode in like they owned the place, spreading across the main road in a tight formation. At least 20 of them this time, their leader, Reaper, at the front. Charlie stood firm near the barricade, a rifle slung over his shoulder. The other townsfolk were positioned behind cover, some in the scrapyard, others inside buildings with vantage points. Morgan had spent the last 2 days drilling them, and now it was time to see if they were ready. Reaper pulled his bike to a slow stop, surveying the scene. He let out a low chuckle. Well, looks like the little town decided to grow a spine. Morgan stepped forward. You got your warning. You don't belong here. Reaper smirked. See, that's where you're wrong. I go where I want. And now you've made this personal. He raised his hand. Morgan didn't wait. She fired first. The shot rang out, shattering the tense silence. The bullet struck the ground just inches from Reaper's front tire, sending up a spray of dirt. In that split second, everything erupted. The Black Vultures fanned out, drawing weapons. Townsfolk opened fire from their positions. The battle for Ironwood Ridge had begun. Morgan ducked behind a truck as bullets tore through the air. The Black Vultures weren't just some disorganized gang. These men knew how to fight. But so did she. She spotted Ethan crouched near the gas pumps, gripping his rifle like a lifeline. "Ethan, focus on your breathing. Aim, then shoot," she called. He nodded shakily, lining up his shot. A second later, one of the vultures dropped to the ground. Charlie and a few of the ranchers had taken cover behind the barricades, laying down steady fire. Grady was in the scrapyard, using his knowledge of the terrain to pick off attackers one by one. But the vultures kept coming. Reaper moved like a man who had nothing to lose, weaving between cover and barking orders. His men followed his lead, pressing forward despite the town's resistance. Morgan reloaded. "We need to break their momentum. Now." Grady's voice crackled through the radio. "Scrapyard's rigged. If we can draw them in, I can set off the charges." Morgan nodded. "Do it." Morgan and Charlie fell back toward the scrapyard, drawing the vultures in. It worked. Thinking they were retreating, Reaper's men surged forward, pushing into the maze of metal and machinery. Then Grady hit the detonator. The explosion rocked the scrapyard, sending metal flying and cutting off half of the gang. Smoke and fire filled the air as confusion spread through the vultures' ranks. Morgan saw her opening. "Now," she shouted. The townsfolk pushed forward, overwhelming the remaining vultures in the chaos. One by one, they fell back, some retreating, others collapsing in the dirt. Then, it was just Reaper. Reaper stood in the middle of the road, his gun empty, his bike overturned. He wiped blood from his lip, smiling as Morgan approached. "You put up a good fight," he admitted. "But you know this won't be the end of it." Morgan leveled her gun at him. "No, it's the end." For the first time, Reaper hesitated. "Leave. Now. And if I ever see you or your gang in this town again, I won't miss it." Reaper's smirk faded. He glanced at his remaining men, what few had survived. He weighed his options. Then, with a slow nod, he turned and walked away. The black vultures were finished. The sun rose over Ironwood Ridge, casting golden light over the battered streets. The town had won, but at a cost. Buildings were damaged, people were injured, but they were standing. Charlie clapped a hand on Morgan's shoulder. "Reckon we owe you a drink." Morgan smirked. "Make it a strong one." Ethan approached, his hands still shaking from the fight. "We really did it, didn't we?" Morgan nodded. "Yeah, kid. We did." As the town began to rebuild, one thing was certain. Ironwood Ridge was theirs, and no one would take it from them again. For the first time in a long while, Morgan Steele allowed herself to believe she had finally found a place worth fighting for. The end.